I'm Chris Corrigan. I'm working with Equity Matters on the story collection and sense-making aspects of our racial equity and racial justice project. Working with stories is an important way to understand what's going on in a community when we're trying to shift the conditions of racism towards justice, towards more equity. It helps if we have a large number of stories gathered from all corners of a community to understand the way racism expresses itself in this particular place. We're collecting stories from across Howard County, hundreds of stories that allow us and citizens and the Howard County Library System to look at the patterns of racism and the patterns of racial equity and justice so that we can effect change in positive ways that works for the county. Our collection of stories is not just about hearing what your own experience is, but about aggregating them together so that citizens can come together to look at the conditions that are creating racism and to be able to shift those. We're using a tool called Spring to collect those stories and in order to do analysis of the work together in the community. And we'll be using the results that we gather through Spring to host community events in which we bring citizens from across the county together to look at these patterns and to think about how they could work together to shift conditions towards more racial equity and justice. I'm going to give you a little tutorial on how to enter your own story. We're collecting stories from all corners of the county, and anybody who wants to can contribute one. I'll show you how you can contribute a story into our tool, and then I'll show you what happens on the other side when we've collected hundreds of stories and how we're going to aggregate them together in order to create community conversation around shifting racial equity and justice. We're going to share with you a link to a questionnaire that's hosted on a website where we're collecting stories of people's experience of racism in Howard County. When you get your link, you'll see a form that looks a little bit like this. First of all, asks you for your consent to participate, and then asks you to select a prompt from these 3 lines. We're looking for stories of something you did or witnessed that gave you hope for improving race relationships with your neighbors in Howard County. Or if you choose, you can tell us a story of something that you did or witnessed in the past few months that seems typical of how race relations work here in Howard County. Or you can share a story of a recent experience of racism in Howard County that made you think things have to change. These are not large stories. These can just be small stories, moments even, something that happened to you in the past week. We'll invite you to write your story here and to share it, give your story a title, and then we're going to ask you a number of questions about your story. This isn't a typical survey where you rate your experience on a scale of 1 to 10. We're going to ask you to tell us where the story happened and the kind of experience it was, and whether or not you think that this is a unique situation or this is common all across Howard County. We use some really novel and interesting ways of helping you to think about your story, including these triangles. The way the triangle works is you place your mouse in the ball and you move it around and find a space within the triangle that best reflects your story. For example, in response to the question that in your story, the actions of the people involved were most influenced by the system they were a part of, personal choices they made, or the circumstances of the moment, we ask you to choose a spot somewhere on that triangle that best reflects what your experience was. There are a number of triangles for you to answer, some checkbox questions that allow you to talk about what your emotions were. And then we also use sliders. For example, in this story, there was a high level of conflict or everyone was working together. Where would you place the slider to indicate what happened in your story? Finally, we ask you what the story tells you about how we should address racism in Howard County. It gives you an opportunity to interpret your story and tell us what we all should be doing. We also ask you to let us know who you think should hear this story. And then following that, we collect some demographic information, your age, your gender, how long you've lived in the county and what district you live in, and what your race is. After you submit your story, it goes into a large story bank, and we'll show you next what we do with those. One of the things that this tool allows us to do is to look for patterns in the collection of stories that we've got. As of the middle of April, we've got about 300 stories in our story collection already, and already we can see some patterns that are starting to emerge. If I circle these stories here, we get to see some of the stories that people told where they said we need to imagine a new possibility in Howard County. When we circle those and we begin to look at these stories, together we can begin to name what that new possibility might be. We can begin to name what those imaginings are. On the other hand, if we decided we wanted to look at building a new system, we could circle some of these stories here and read through them and ask the question, what's the kind of system that we could build that would create more stories like the positive ones in this group and fewer stories like the negative one? This activity is called sense making. And what's unique about our project is that we gather the community together, cohorts of folks that are being trained in racial equity and justice, cohorts of ordinary citizens who have an interest in improving life in Howard County. And we give them collections of stories selected for some of these patterns in order to make sense of the conditions and think about which kinds of changes we need to make in the county. It's a very powerful tool, and it allows us to work with the voices of citizens. We don't edit these stories, we don't interpret these stories. These stories are the way they are in raw format. Being able to sit down together with a diverse group of people from across the county means we get the benefit of diversity and diverse perspectives in both making sense of the conditions in Howard County and also coming up with ideas for how we can shift things. This is part of a much larger initiative where we're trying to create systemic changes to increase racial equity and racial justice in Howard County. And we're doing that by being inspired by the voices of citizens, by taking action together based on the sense we make about the community and our possible futures. We're really excited for you to join us, either by contributing stories or by helping us to make sense of them and participating in community events. We look forward to seeing you there.